How to sew the falling leaves quilt. This is part of the Just Charming range of instructions by Amber Makes. Cutting out. Start by selecting or cutting out all of the charm squares you want to use for the maple leaf blocks. You'll need 24 for the outer leaves, so you need to now cut these into individual pieces. So I'm just taking one of the charm squares here and cutting it into 2 pieces for the outer leaf. The measurements for this are listed in the instructions. Make sure you cut carefully, so you cut them so that they're accurately the same size as listed in the instructions. Then repeat that to cut all the 24 charm squares to make 48 outer leaves. Now take the next set of 24 charm squares, and I'm going to select a different print this time so that I can use 2 different prints in my leaf. Now cut this into 2 pieces, 1 piece for the large centre leaf and 1 piece for the small centre leaf. Again, the exact measurements for these leaves are listed in the instructions. I'm using the rotary cutter and ruler here to make sure that my pieces are accurately cut so my finished block all matches up. So that's the large centre leaf piece, and now I'm trimming the small centre leaf piece. That extra piece you won't need. Now to cut out the pieces for the stems, you'll need 5 charm squares for all of the stems, and each of these charm squares needs to be cut into 5 pieces. Again, the measurements for this are listed in the instructions. So I'm going to cut this into the 5 stem pieces. So there's the 5 stem pieces cut out. Repeat that to cut out all of the stem pieces. Now I've put them all into piles, and you might find it easier to label them at this stage so that you've got a pile of outer leaves, a pile of large centre leaves and a pile of small centre leaves and a pile of stems. You'll also need some background fabric pieces to make the maple leaf blocks, and again the measurements for these are all listed in the instructions. Make sure you label them so you remember which piece is which. Then put all these to one side, and these will be used for assembling the maple leaf blocks. Now you need to cut out all the medium fabric and the dark fabric that's used for the chains. So you can see here, if you have a look at the instructions, all the measurements are listed. Some of the pieces you have to cut across the full width of fabric and some of them across the half width, and these need to be labelled so you remember which is which. So those are the medium strips. These are the dark fabric strips. You can see I've cut a whole pile of strips all the same width and across the full width of the fabric. And you need another couple of smaller pieces where you subcut one large strip into smaller pieces, and you can see I've labelled those. That's block B set 2, just so that I remember when I'm creating them. Next, cut the background fabric. You'll notice in the instructions I've listed 2 sets of cutting, because you can use 60-inch wide fabric like I've done here, which is a calico, or you can use the normal 44-inch width quilt fabric. Just follow the cutting instructions that are listed depending on the fabric width you're using, and then don't forget to label all the pieces like I've done here so that you remember which is which when you're assembling the quilt. So these are the wide fabric strips. You'll have wide, medium and narrow. And then some of those fabric strips will be subcut, and those are the ones that I've labelled here. Then finally, cut the binding strips from the dark fabric. Put these all into a pile, and you can label them if you like, and these will be used at the very end to bind your quilt. Making a maple leaf block. Start by taking all the fabric pieces you need for just one block. You've got 2 outer leaf sections, a centre large leaf section, a centre small leaf section and 1 stem piece. Then take the background fabric pieces that you need. You'll have 5 leaf squares, 1 stem square, 2 short borders and 2 long borders. Put these all into one pile and then you can use these for making 1 maple leaf block. Making the outer leaf sections. Take 2 of the leaf squares and 2 of the outer leaf pieces. Now on the background leaf squares, draw a diagonal line from one corner to the opposite corner on the wrong side. And then repeat that with the other leaf square. Now take one of your outer leaf pieces and place 1 leaf square right side down on top, matching up the top and side raw edges. The drawn diagonal line should run from bottom left to top right. Pin it into place either side of the drawn line. Then sew along the drawn line. Once that's done, remove the pins, place it on your ironing board. Fold the left corner over so it meets up with the left corner and press into place. Now open those up and trim the seam allowance to about 1/4 inch. By pressing it first, it means that it will be nice and neat and match up properly. Fold it back over and give it another press. This completes the top outer leaf section. Now take the other outer leaf piece and take the other drawn square, but this time the diagonal line needs to run from top left to bottom right. Pin it into place. Sew along the drawn diagonal line again. Remove the pins once it's done. Fold the corner over so they match up in the top right hand corner. Give it a press. This will give you a more even finish by folding it and trimming it in 2 different stages. Trim off the seam allowance. Press it back over again, and this completes the bottom outer leaf section. Put these to one side for now and you'll use them later for assembling the maple leaf block. Making the centre leaf sections. Take 2 of the leaf square pieces and draw a diagonal line on the wrong side of each one from one corner to the opposite corner, just like we did before, using an erasable pen. Now take the large centre leaf piece and place one of the drawn squares right sides down on top so that the diagonal line runs from bottom left to top right. And then pin it into place and sew along that drawn diagonal line. Once this is done, open it out, fold the corners over so the left-hand corners meet up. Give it a press. Then open it up and trim off the seam allowances to about 1/4 inch. Open it up again, just press it back into place, and this completes the large centre leaf section. Now take the small centre leaf piece and one of the leaf squares and place the leaf square right sides down on top. The drawn diagonal line should run from top left to bottom right. Pin the 2 together and then sew along the drawn diagonal line. Fold the corner over of the leaf square so the right hand corners meet up and give it a press. And then open up the 2 fabric pieces and trim the seam allowance to 1/4 inch outside the seam. Fold the leaf square back over and press it to hold it in place, and this completes the small centre leaf section. Making the stem section. Take the background fabric stem square and place your ruler diagonally across it on the wrong side from one corner to the other and draw a line just along the centre. Now turn it round and then cut from one corner to the other to create 2 triangles. Each triangle will now have its centre mark in place. Take the stem fabric piece, measure and mark the centre of the long edge. You can either do this by folding it half, or if you open it up, you can take a ruler, measure the halfway point, and do mark these centre lines with a pen. It helps for matching up later. Now take the stem fabric piece and place it right sides down on top of one triangle, matching up those centre points. By marking them in advance, it makes this a lot easier and it's more accurate. So pin the stem to that stem triangle, and pin together, and then sew together. Open it up, just you finger press it for now, then place the other long edge of the stem on the other triangle, again matching up those centre points, and then pin it together all the way along and stitch. Open it up and press the seam allowances towards the stem, as this will make it slightly raised. You now need to trim this into a 2.5 inch square. And the best way to do this is if you draw a line down the centre of the stem piece, then take your ruler and place the diagonal line on the ruler on the drawn line down the centre of the stem. Just like this. You're going to cut it into a 2.5 inch square, so make sure that it's 2.5 inches. There's enough room either side. Cut it along that right hand edge, turn it round, and then trim it so it's 2.5 inches wide. Turn it round just one turn. Place the edge of the ruler on the bottom of that drawn line, because the aim here is that your stem runs centrally down this square, and then turn it around, and if you trim that now to 2.5 inches, your stem will be running straight down the centre with nice corners either end. And that's your stem square finished. Assembling the maple leaf block. Lay out the top outer leaf section, bottom outer leaf section, the large centre leaf section, the small centre leaf section, the stem section and the remaining leaf square right side up in the arrangement shown here. I've also put a diagram on the instructions of this arrangement so you can refer to that instead. Lay it all out so you know what order to join everything in. Start by taking the top outer leaf section and the large centre leaf section and place them right sides together, making sure they stay in the arrangement that you've had laying down. Pin them together along the seam that you want to join. Then sew this together and press the seam to one side and lay that back down in the arrangement. Now take the top leaf square and the small centre leaf section and sew those together. Again, press the seam to one side and put it back in the arrangement. Sew this joined leaf square with the small centre leaf section to the right hand side of those joined large centre leaf sections. If you always refer to the block diagram or keep it laid out in the assembly, you'll know that you've joined the right side to the right piece. Pin them together either end and then pin them together in the centre. Just because of all the seams you've got here, they can sometimes need stretching out a bit to fit. Sew it together and press the seam to one side. Sew the stem section right sides facing to the bottom outer leaf section. And press the seam to one side. Now you can join this to the bottom of the top sections. Place it right sides facing, but double check to make sure that those seams are facing in opposite directions. You can repress one of them if they're not, but this will just help to make sure that you can nest the seams, because this is the only seam that you need to match up. So if you've got them facing in opposite directions, you can nest the seams nicely, pin them together at that seam, and then pin them at either end. Sew together, and that completes the maple leaf. Now to make it into a block, you need to put the borders on. So take one maple leaf block short border and sew it right sides facing to the top of the maple leaf. Have the maple leaf fabric piece on top because this is where the seams are. And because you've pressed those seams over to one side, you need to make sure they stay over to one side just so everything lays flat. So if you have the pieced section on top, then as you're sewing, you can make sure those seams stay pressed over to that one side. Take another maple leaf block short border and pin that to the bottom edge of the maple leaf. Again, working from the maple leaf side where all the seams are, and then you can make sure those seams stay facing the right way when you stitch. If you do it the other way round, you can't see the seams as they're underneath, and sometimes they get a bit twisted. And this just helps to give a neater, flatter finish to your finished maple leaf block. So sew these in place and press the seams open. Now take one maple leaf block long border and pin that to the other side, again keeping the seamed side on top. So I've got the long border underneath and then the maple leaf block on top. Pin them together at either end. And then give it a little pull at either end to make sure it fits, because obviously the seams can pull the fabric in a little bit. So if you pin it either end, then pin it in the centre. Then take the other long border and pin that to the other end. Make sure that you have the raw edges on the sides and the top matching up. So just adjust it so that the short edges match up, and then you can give it a little pull. That just pulls out the seams to make sure that they fit. And then sew the long borders into place. And press the seams open. And this completes one maple leaf block. Now you need to repeat this whole process to make 24 maple leaf blocks in total that I've done here. So you can see that I've always used the same fabric for the outer leaves and then the same fabric for the centre leaf, and it just gives it a nice finish. But you can mix and match this up if you prefer. You can have different coloured leaves, all depending on what you do. I've also, as you can see, cut the stems so that the stripes run one way on some and another way on others, but it's up to you. Make it your own by mixing and matching the prints. Making the chain blocks. Let's start by making the chain block A sets, and we're going to start with block A set 1. This set of piece squares is used in row 1 and row 5. Join together strips of fabric in the following order by sewing them right sides facing. You need a dark chain strip, then a wide background strip, and then a dark chain strip. You'll notice when you've cut out all your pieces, you'll have 2 sets of these, so we're just going to start with one group at a time. So lay them out and take the dark chain strip and place that right sides facing along the top long edge of the wide background strip. If you lay them out in this order first, then you can make sure they're in the right order. So place the dark chain strip right sides facing along the top long edge of the wide background strip and pin it into place, matching up those selvage edges and also the raw long edges across the top. And then continue pinning it in place all the way along. Then take the other dark chain strip and place that right sides facing along the bottom raw long edge of the wide background strip. As you can see here, you can pin and sew one strip on at a time, but I find it easier to pin both of the strips on and then sew them both on at one time, and continue pinning all the way along. Then sew the two strips into place. Once that's done, turn it over and press the seams towards the plain fabric, the dark fabric, so not towards the background fabric, but towards the chain fabric. If you're using extra wide fabric like this calico, you'll have a bit left over at the end, but you can just keep that and add that to your stash. You won't need that. So I've created two groups now of the sets of 3 strips here. Now you need to subcut them. Subcutting is a process when you join together one big piece like this and cut it into smaller pieces. Lay it on your cutting mat and line up the top edge of that strip along one of the lines of your cutting mat, and then you know it's straight. Now take the ruler, and we need to cut off the selvage edges as well as straightening it up. So line up one of the lines on your ruler along one of the lines on your cutting mat so that you know it's straight. It'll be at right angles because you've lined up the top long edges with your cutting mat. You now need to subcut, which means to cut a smaller piece across the whole width. So you need to cut these into 2.5-inch strips, but again, all the measurements are listed in the instructions. So make sure that you line up the top and side raw edges and cut to make the 2.5-inch strip. This process of subcutting makes cutting a lot easier and more accurate because you're not joining together so many little pieces. Then continue cutting all the way along here to make 16 segments. Then subcut the other join group to make another 16 segments, and then you will have 32 segments in total. The leftover piece, if you're using wider fabric, you can put to one side. Write a label that says Block A, Set 1, and pin that to the top, because you'll use these later and it's important you know which piece is which, and put it to one side. Making Block A, Set 2. This set of piece squares is used in row 2 and row 4. So take all the narrow background strips you've cut and all the light chain strips that you've cut. There you can see they're all here. Now lay them out in the following order so that the right sides are up. Take a narrow background strip and a light chain strip, then another narrow background strip, another light chain strip, and finally another narrow background strip. So you've got 5 strips in total which alternate. Now you need to pin these 5 and sew these 5 pieces together right sides facing. You can do them one at a time and press the seams. Once you've done it, press the seams towards the chain fabric. Always press seams towards the chain fabric, not the background fabric. This will help everything to nest together when you join it together later. Make another group of these 5 pieces of fabric in the same way. So you've got 2 groups that are all joined together along the full width of the fabric. Now you need to subcut these into smaller strips. So just like we did before, line up your join strips along one of the horizontal lines on your cutting mat. Then you know that it's straight. Then take your ruler and we're going to trim off the selvages and straighten up the end. Place one of the vertical lines on the ruler so it lines up with one of the lines of the cutting mat, as you can see here, and then trim it across. So that piece you can discard. It looks like an odd shape, but now you've got it nice and straight. Now you can now subcut this into the individual strips. Again, measurements are in the instructions for this. So you can cut them one by one, or I've got a slightly wider ruler, so I do them in sets of 3. So I cut it at 2.5 inches, and then to cut another 2.5 strip, I put my ruler at 5 inches, and then for the third one, if I move my ruler along to the 7.5 inches, that means that I haven't got to keep moving, and I cut just 3 strips at a time. Continue cutting across the whole width until you have 16 strips, and then do that with the other group, and then you will have 32 segments in total. Write a label and pin it to the top that says Block A, Set 2. And then put these to one side for assembling the chains later. Making Block A, Set 3. This set of piece squares is used in row 3. So take one medium background fabric strip, then a dark chain strip, and then another medium background fabric strip. And place them in this order so that the dark chain strip runs down the centre, and then pin them together along the whole length and then sew them together to make one big fabric piece. And again, press the seams towards the chain fabric. Now you need to subcut this, so line up the top long edge with one of the lines on your cutting mat. Line up one of the vertical lines on your ruler with the vertical lines of the cutting mat, and trim off the selvages to straighten up the edge. Now subcut this into individual segments in exactly the same way as you did with the other sets. Make sure the lines are always matching up along the top. And also, if you want, with these narrower strips, you can also line up your ruler with the seam on that joins the narrower strip to the wider strip, just to make sure it's all matching up. And then cut your strips in exactly the same way. Now, one tip that I have is once you've cut out a few strips, just make sure that everything is still square, because sometimes if you just cut one strip slightly off, it can make the end not quite square. So line up the top edge again and just trim off the edge. If you do this when you cut about every 3 or 4 segments, then you'll just make sure that you've always got them at perfect right angles. You only need to trim off the tiniest bit just to keep it square, and then continue cutting a few more strips. So if you cut a few strips, line it up, make sure the end is square, retrim it. Then cut 16 of these in total and write a label and pin this to the top labelled Block A, Set 3, and put these to one side. Assembling the chain Block A sets. Take all the segments that you've already made, and to assemble one of the chain block sets, you need to take 2 Block A Set 1 segments, 2 Set 2s. I'm just taking them from underneath the pile so I can keep the label on top, and one of the Block A Set 3 segments. Put the others to one side. Now place all of the segments up in the following order so that you've got 1, 2, 3, 2, and then 1. Now these all need to be sewn right sides together to make the one block. Because you press the seams towards the chain fabric, this will help them to nest really nicely so that you can match the seams. So place number 1 and number 2 right sides facing. And you can see, because the seams have been pressed towards the chain fabric, all you have to do is take the top one, and to nest them together, just pull the top one very gently until the seams crash or nest together, and pin together at the seams. And then where you need to match the other seams, do the same thing. Just take the top one, pull it very gently until you can feel the seams matching together, pin together at the seams, then sew together. And in the same way, sew all of the strips together in the same order, nesting the seams and pinning together as you go. This creates the finished chain block A, and you can see I've pressed the seams on the back as well. Now repeat this with the rest of the block A segments to create 16 chain block A in total, as you can see here. Then put these to one side. Making the chain block B sets. We'll start by making block B set 1. This set of piece squares is used in row 1 and row 5. Now these are assembled in the same way as you did with set A, but just in a different order. So take the light chain strip, a wide background strip and a light chain strip and sew them together to make one long group, just like you did before, right sides together matching the raw edges. You'll also have some smaller pieces. These were labelled block B set 1 when you cut them out. So sew these smaller pieces together in the same order, so you've got a light chain, wide background and light chain. It's the same as the larger group that you've just made, it's just a smaller piece. So sew these, and also remember to press the fabric towards the chain fabric. Now in the same way as you did with set 1, you need to trim these and subcut them into smaller segments. So line up the top raw edge of that light chain strip with the horizontal line on your cutting mat. Line up the vertical lines of your ruler with the vertical lines of your cutting mat and trim off the edge. Then subcut this into 16 segments exactly as you did before. All the measurements and the details for this are all in the instructions, so refer to these as you go along just to make sure that you're cutting everything the right width. And then continue in this way to cut the whole group into 16 segments. Then take that smaller piece that you joined together earlier and cut this into 2 segments. The reason that we do this is we only need 18 segments for these blocks, so there's no point in doing 2 whole groups like you did when you did set A. You just need 1 whole group and a little bit as a smaller group, because you will have less of the chain block B sets than you will have the chain block A. So trim this and subcut into 2 segments, and then put that together with the 16 that you've already cut. Now you've got 18 segments. Write a label, block B, set 1, and pin that to the top and put these to one side. Block B, set 2. This set of P-squares is used in row 2 and row 4. Now lay out the strips in the following order: narrow background strip, dark chain strip, narrow background strip, dark chain strip and narrow background strip. So you can see these are in the opposite orders when you did block A. But if you always refer very carefully to the instructions, all of this detail of what order to put what strips in is listed. So just double check. So you've got them in the following order, and then sew them, pin and sew them right sides facing. And then you will also have some smaller pieces, because you only need to make 2 segments for this, just like you did when you did set 1. So lay them out, these smaller pieces, so that you've got background, dark chain, background, dark chain, and then background at the bottom. And then sew them together, right sides facing. And then don't forget to press the seams always towards the chain fabric. And do that with the smallest grouped piece as well. Then you need to subcut this large group just like you did before, lining up the top raw edge with the horizontal line on your cutting mat. Take your ruler, line up one of the vertical lines of the ruler with the vertical line of your cutting mat, and just trim off the selvage to make it straight. Then you can cut this into segments. You will get 16 segments from this larger joined group. And then take the smaller joined group, and again don't forget to trim off the edge, because you can see here it's not very straight, which is just what happens when you sew lots of strips together. The edges often go off at an angle, but that's easily remedied when you just straighten it up. And then cut this smaller group into 2 strips. You'll have a little bit left over that you can just discard. Now put all of those trim strips together and you will have 18 segments in total. Write a label and pin it on top, block B, set 2, and then put these to one side. Block B, set 3. This set of P-squares is used in row 3. So take a medium background strip and then place a light chain strip beneath it and then a medium background strip below that. Then sew these 3 strips together as you've done before and press the seams over towards the chain strip. Now trim this down as before, smooth out the fabric, make sure the vertical and horizontal lines are all lining up and then trim into segments. You need 9 segments for this set. So cut along the whole group. Once you've got your 9 segments, write a label, pin it to the top with block B, set 3 and put that to one side. Assembling the chain blocks B. To assemble one chain block B, take 2 block B set 1 segments and then put the others to one side. Take 2 block B set 2 segments and put the others to one side, and then take 1 block B set 3 segment and put the others to one side. Now take these 5 segments and place them together in the following order: 1, 2, 3, 2 and 1. Now you need to join all of these right sides facing in this order to make the block B. But as with block A, it's important that you nest the seams. But because you pressed all the seams towards the chain fabric, they will nest really easily. So just slide the top fabric slightly towards the bottom fabric until you feel the seams join up, pin them together, and then sew together the whole block and press the seams. You can either press them open or to one side. And then repeat this with the remaining segments so that you have 9 chain block B in total. Assembling the quilt top. Lay the completed blocks right side up in 7 rows with 7 blocks in each row. Refer to the quilt label diagram that's in the instructions to see which blocks to place where. Then make sure you put all of the blocks together in a pile and label them. You can see this is pile 1. When you place the maple leaf blocks, rotate them so the leaves are facing in different directions. That's why I've put an arrow at the top of each one. So you can see with row 2, I've labelled it row 2 and put them in the right order. So that you've got the row 2 and you've got the A and B blocks alternating with the maple leaf blocks that I have rotated. But if you refer to the quilt layout diagram, you'll be able to see exactly what to place where. But if you just place them all into piles like this and label each pile, it makes it a lot easier when you're coming to sew them together. So here's pile 5, pile 6 and pile 7. Now take the first pile, which is row 1, and we're going to sew these in a horizontal row, right sides facing. So take the first block and place that right sides facing along the left-hand edge of the second block, which is your maple leaf block, and sew that together. And then sew the next block and sew that right sides together. And continue doing that until you've sewn the whole row together, as you can see here. And then press the seams open as you go, as you do each block. So there's row 1, and you can see I've stitched that together. And here's row 2. Now I've sewn row 1 to row 2. So once you've done the rows, sew the rows together. I find it easier to sew them in pairs. So if you sew row 1 and row 2 together, then press the seams open. Then take rows 3 and 4 and press sew them together and press the seams open. It's just a bit more manageable to sew them together in pairs and then sew all of those pairs together. And then here is row 5 and row 6. If you keep the labels on them until you've finished the whole quilt, then you won't forget which row goes in which order. So now take your pairs. So here's pair 3 and 4. And then take pair 1 and 2 and sew those together. It's less fabric to be dealing with, and also you can check your accuracy. Remember, all of those seams are nested because you pressed the chain fabric to one side. So when you're joining the blocks, it's quite easy because you can just nest the seams. So join rows 1 and 2 to 3 and 4. And then once you've done that, join rows 5 and 6 below rows 3 and 4. And then you can join row 7 along the bottom. So you can see I've now sewn together the whole quilt. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and finally row 7 at the bottom. So now you've joined the blocks together, you can see that the chain is created with the light and the dark fabrics alternating. When the blocks are joined together, you can see them all alternating, and the maple leaves are surrounded by the chains. Finishing the quilt. Once you have layered and quilted your quilt, you can bind it using the binding strips you cut earlier. The instructions tell you how to bind it and how to create the mitered corners. And also, if you visit the Amber Makes website, we've created a detail how to bind a quilt tutorial for you, which explains how to cut the strips, miter the corners and join them, and either machine or hand sew them into place.